Picture a woman lying in the sand for 38 centuries. Her eyelashes are still curled. Her lips still hold the ghost of a smile. Her skin has not turned to dust or bone. It has simply gone quiet, like she is resting between breaths. When explorers first uncovered her, they assumed her story was simple, a traveler from far away who crossed a continent and never made it home. Decades later, a DNA lab would prove that assumption almost completely wrong, and in doing so would crack open one of the strangest deserts on the planet, a place that hides an ocean under its dunes, grows forests that shouldn't be able to grow, and produces sand that actually sings. This is the story of what scientists found underneath one of the most hostile landscapes on Earth, and why it is forcing researchers to rewrite what they thought they understood about deserts entirely. The desert in question is the Taklamakan, a sea of shifting dunes in the far west of China, in the Xinjiang region. Its name is often explained as coming from a phrase meaning, "You can go in, but you may never come out," and the landscape earns that reputation. Summers bake the sand to blistering temperatures, winters drop it below freezing, and rainfall is almost non-existent. It sits inside the Tarim Basin, a massive bowl of land ringed by some of the highest mountain ranges on the planet, including the Himalayas, the Tian Shan, and the Kunlun Range. For most of modern history, this basin looked like exactly what a desert is supposed to look like: dry, empty, and largely irrelevant to the story of human civilization. That reputation began to fall apart at the start of the 20th century, when explorers picked through the dunes and stumbled onto a cemetery that did not belong in a desert at all. The site became known as the Small River Cemetery, or Xiaohe, and it was unlike any burial ground archaeologists had documented before. Instead of stone markers, the site was crowded with tall wooden poles shaped like oars, jutting straight up out of a raised, terraced dune, almost like the masts of a fleet that had been swallowed by sand. Underneath those poles were boat-shaped coffins, each one wrapped tightly in raw animal hide that had shrunk and hardened over the centuries, sealing everything inside into what was essentially a natural, airtight capsule. When researchers opened those hide wrappings, they did not find crumbling skeletons. They found bodies that looked almost untouched by time, preserved not through any embalming process, but through a rare combination of salty soil, bone-dry air, and that tight animal skin seal. Among the remains was a woman who came to be called the Beauty of Xiaohe, buried roughly 3,800 years ago. Her felt hat, decorated with feathers, was still intact. Her woven wool cloak, fastened with a wooden pin, still held its shape. Her face still carried a calm, faint expression that made her look almost alive. But it was her features, and those of other mummies found nearby, that set off a century of debate. These were not the facial structures typically associated with the region's East Asian populations. They were tall individuals with deep-set eyes, prominent noses, and hair that ranged from brown to a striking reddish tone. Their woven textiles carried plaid and twill patterns that resembled cloth from Bronze Age Central Europe far more than anything local. For generations, the explanation seemed obvious. This had to be a population of Indo-European herders who trekked thousands of miles from the Eurasian steppe, arriving in this remote desert basin long before anyone imagined outsiders could have reached it. The only real question left, historians assumed, was which route they had taken to get there. That assumption held for roughly a century, until genetic sequencing caught up with the mystery. Around 2021, a team of international geneticists analyzed whole genome data pulled from more than a dozen individuals connected to the Xiaohe culture, along with additional remains from the nearby Zungarian Basin, some dating back over 4,000 years. The results, published in the journal Nature, did not confirm a migration story at all. They dismantled it. The Tarim Basin mummies carried essentially none of the genetic markers linked to the Yamnaya steppe herders who were long assumed to be their ancestors. They also lacked the ancestry patterns tied to early European farming populations, and they did not closely match neighboring East Asian groups either. Instead, their genomes pointed to something far older and far stranger, a lineage known as the ancient North Eurasians. To understand why that finding stunned researchers, it helps to know what the ancient North Eurasians actually were. This was a population of hunter-gatherers who lived across Siberia and parts of northern Eurasia during the depths of the last ice age, tens of thousands of years ago. As the glaciers retreated and human populations mixed and remixed across the continent, this group's distinct genetic signature blended into nearly everyone else, surviving today only as scattered fragments inside the DNA of modern Siberians, Native Americans, and some Europeans, rather than as an intact population anywhere. The Darim Basin mummies were different. Their DNA showed unusually high, largely undiluted levels of this ancestry, suggesting they were not recent arrivals who had wandered in from somewhere else, but descendants of a population that had likely been living in and around that basin for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, quietly preserved by the very isolation that made the region so forbidding. That discovery flips the old narrative on its head. The people buried at Xiaohe were not travelers who had just finished an epic migration and settled down. Genetically, they appear to have been residents who stayed largely in place for millennia while the rest of Eurasia's populations shifted, mixed, and moved around them. Their unusual, so-called Western appearance was not evidence of a long journey. It was closer to a snapshot of an old, ancestral human type that had simply survived in genetic isolation while it vanished almost everywhere else. That isolation is what makes the second part of the discovery so strange. Populations that keep almost entirely to themselves for that long tend to be culturally closed off too. The Xiaohe people were the opposite. Even though their bloodlines stayed remarkably separate, their graves are packed with evidence of wide cultural borrowing. Researchers have found wheat and barley, crops that originated far away in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. They have found broomcorn millet, a grain domesticated in what is now North China. Chemical analysis of dental remains has even turned up evidence of dairy consumption, a lifestyle likely picked up from herding cultures to the north. Add in medicinal plants used across ancient Asia, and a picture emerges of a community that sat at a genuine crossroads, absorbing ideas, crops, and technologies from every direction while deliberately keeping their bloodlines closed. They were, in a sense, cultural sponges who refused to intermarry, a combination that is genuinely unusual in the archaeological record. None of that, however, explains how an isolated population managed to farm and herd livestock in the middle of one of the driest places on the surface of the earth. That question leads to the second major discovery buried in this landscape, and this one is not archaeological at all. It is hydrological. For years, researchers studying carbon dioxide levels around the Darim Basin kept running into numbers that did not add up. Deserts are typically expected to be carbon neutral, or close to it, since there is so little vegetation to absorb the gas. But in this basin, carbon dioxide kept disappearing in quantities that made no sense. A team led by researcher Li Yan, working with the Chinese Academy of Sciences Xinjiang Institute of Ecology and Geography, spent roughly a decade chasing that mystery. Their answer, published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters, was almost hard to believe. Buried deep beneath the Taklamakan sits a massive aquifer, holding roughly 10 times as much water as all 5 of North America's Great Lakes combined. This is not water anyone could drink or use to irrigate a field. It is an intensely salty, highly alkaline brine, built up over thousands of years as snowmelt and rain from the surrounding mountains filtered down through mineral-rich rock and seeped deep into the basin. But that same alkaline chemistry is exactly what makes the water such an effective carbon trap. As water moves through irrigated farmland at the surface, it picks up dissolved carbon dioxide and carries it downward into these deep underground reservoirs, where it becomes locked away, essentially removed from the atmosphere on what researchers describe as close to a one-way trip. By the team's estimate, the aquifer beneath the Darim Basin alone may be storing somewhere in the range of 20 billion metric tons of carbon, and the researchers behind the study suggested that similar hidden reservoirs could exist beneath other major desert basins around the world, potentially adding up to a genuinely significant, previously overlooked piece of the planet's carbon cycle. It reframes deserts entirely, turning what looked like a lifeless void into an active, if very slow, participant in regulating the atmosphere above it. Knowing there is a hidden reservoir beneath the sand is one thing. Actually stabilizing the surface above it, so the desert stops swallowing roads, railways, and towns, is a separate and much more immediate problem, and it's one China has spent decades trying to solve. The traditional method for holding shifting dunes in place involves laying straw into the sand in a checkerboard grid, physically breaking up wind patterns so grains cannot blow freely. It works, but it is slow, labor-intensive, and temporary, since the straw eventually decomposes. In nature, deserts eventually stabilize themselves through a much slower process, as cyanobacteria, mosses, and lichens gradually colonize bare sand over the course of decades or even centuries, secreting sticky compounds that bind grains together into a thin, dark biological crust. That crust locks the surface in place, retains moisture, and eventually creates conditions where larger plants can take root. The problem is timing. Waiting a century for nature to finish that job is not practical when dunes are actively burying infrastructure right now. Researchers working at desert research stations in China, including long-running facilities focused on desertification control, have spent years trying to compress that natural timeline. Their approach involves cultivating specific strains of desert-adapted cyanobacteria in controlled tanks, then combining them with a nutrient-rich, paste-like mixture that can be sprayed directly onto open sand. In field trials, crusts that would ordinarily take decades to form under natural conditions have developed in closer to a year, dramatically cutting wind erosion on treated dunes and giving the surface enough stability for further vegetation to establish. It is still an emerging technique, and scientists studying it are careful to note that results vary by site and conditions, but it represents a genuine shift toward using biology, rather than brute force labor, to fight desertification at scale. That biological groundwork feeds directly into China's much larger, decades-long reforestation effort, officially known as the Three North Shelterbelt Program and more commonly referred to as the Great Green Wall. The ambition behind the project is enormous, a belt of trees and vegetation stretching thousands of kilometers across the country's arid north, intended to slow the expansion of deserts like the Taklamakan and the Gobi. It has not been a smooth story. In the program's earlier decades, planners leaned heavily on fast-growing species like poplar and willow, planted in dense, single-species stands. For a while, this looked like a success, with visible green belts appearing across previously barren land. But those trees demanded far more water than the region's shallow, fragile aquifers could sustain, and by the late 1990s and early 2000s, water tables in some areas had dropped sharply. Large numbers of trees died off, and because the plantings were genetically uniform, outbreaks of pests like the Asian longhorned beetle were able to tear through entire sections with little resistance from any surviving biodiversity. It was a costly lesson in the limits of forcing a forest onto a landscape that was never built to support one. In response, the program shifted its strategy toward hardier, low-water native shrubs such as Saxol and Caragana korshinsky, species with deep root systems that stabilize soil, while using a fraction of the water demanded by fast-growing trees. Planting methods have also become far more precise, increasingly relying on mechanized and automated seeding equipment that places vegetation at calculated depths and spacing based on local soil and moisture conditions, rather than blanket planting at high density. And in an unexpected twist, researchers studying the trees that do survive at these desert margins have found that, under the right spacing and conditions, they can accumulate biomass noticeably faster than comparable forests growing in more temperate, well-watered parts of the country. The likely explanation involves reduced competition for light and root space combined with elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, allowing trees in these carefully spaced desert plantings to photosynthesize with far less interference than their crowded counterparts elsewhere. The lesson learned the hard way, essentially, was that fighting a desert with sheer force fails, while working within its water limits can succeed, sometimes surprisingly well.
These same megadunes are also responsible for one of the desert's strangest sounds. When sand slides down their steep faces, either from footsteps, a landslide, or strong wind, the dunes can emit a deep, resonant, droning noise, sometimes described as sounding like distant machinery. Historical travelers, including Marco Polo, attributed sounds like these to desert spirits. The modern explanation involves what scientists call booming or singing sand, which requires very specific conditions. Grains are extremely uniform in size, rounded, and completely dry on the surface. When a layer of that sand begins to slide, The grains collide with each other in near-perfect synchronization, and those countless tiny collisions combine into a single, amplified sound wave, with the dune structure acting almost like the body of a giant instrument. Taken together, these discoveries paint a picture of a landscape that has almost nothing in common with the empty, lifeless void deserts are usually assumed to be. Beneath the surface of the Taklamakan and its surrounding basin lies a genetic record stretching back to the Ice Age, a brine reservoir quietly pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, engineered microbial life racing to hold sand in place, forests that grow faster than they should, and dunes tall enough to anchor themselves and loud enough to sing. What looked, for most of human history, like the definition of emptiness turns out to be one of the more dynamic, layered environments scientists have studied in recent years, and researchers are still working through what else might be buried in the sand.